Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. Coming up today, the programme for government. Well, I suppose we should ask, where was it? There wasn't really much there. John Swinney, of course, had brought this forward from September, when this is normally done, to announce only 6 bills in the programme for government. So was it a programme for government at all? We'll ask that. And of course, it's the anniversary of his becoming First Minister. Perhaps a little report card on where stand the SNP. Interesting poll out. It's interesting in that it's got Reform up at 19%, and the SNP have dipped below 35. We'll chew over that. But in terms of trend, it's broadly in line with others. Nicola Sturgeon breaking her silence on gender reform. Bet you Mr. Swinney was really glad about that. And there's all sorts of bits and bobs going around today. Bank of England, perhaps another cut in interest rates, more aggressive than perhaps we were led to believe. So we'll chew over all of this in the next half hour to 40 minutes. But first of all, I suppose, Alex, in relation to the programme for government, the obvious question was, where's the beef?
Well, indeed. But, this is year 5 of the Parliament, coming towards the end of the SNP's second decade in office. There was a slight sort of sense of, well, where are the dragons to be slayed about the programme for government that John Swinney announced. You're right, only 6 bills. One of them is the budget, which they have to have. 2 of them are relatively minor tweaks to relatively obscure parts of Scots law, that may well be necessary and useful and dutiful, but are not the sorts of things to be setting the heather alight, even with the aid of a can of kerosene. So yes, where is the beef? But I think this was, in some respects, a programme for government that is very John Swinney. That is to say, there is an awareness, I think, at the top end of the Scottish government now, led by John Swinney and Kate Forbes. And Kate Forbes' influence on how the government operates these days should not be underestimated. There was a sense that doing more isn't necessarily doing better. And there are lots of things that the government can do that don't require primary legislation. So, for instance, improvements to the NHS, getting the NHS up and running, getting better productivity in the NHS doesn't require an act of Parliament to do that. It just requires better administration. Now, the extent to which government ministers, of course, are responsible for that is something that may be debated quite reasonably. But, because obviously a lot of, the improvements in the NHS, if they're to happen, have to come from within the organisation itself. They can't be imposed by ministerial fiat. But I think there was, the broad theme of the programme for government, if you can consider it such, is that, we have to do better, but that doesn't necessarily mean doing more.
Yeah, and of course, we were told that he wanted a full year in terms of legislative scrutiny, so he was bringing this forward. But the bills are so non-controversial that I just don't think that holds water. One of the interesting things that when I went on to when I went online to find out the content of all of these bills, very few people, in fact, I couldn't find anyone who actually reported on the bills, because the bills are so non-controversial. Just to run through them, because people will say, well, it's a legislative programme. What is the legislation coming forward? The budget number 5 bill, as you rightly point out, we get that every year. Children and young people, brackets, care bill. Contract, brackets, formation and remedies bill. That'll be a tidying up exercise, probably based on Scottish Law Commission recommendations. Digital Assets Bill, Heat in Buildings Bill, and Non-Surgical Cosmetic Procedures Bill. So there we are. This was all brought forward from September in order that there was a full year of scrutiny on these bills, which I think are are so non-contentious that they would have gone through anyway. This, of course, was Mr. Swinney firing the starting gun, effectively, in what's going to be a very, very long election campaign. And although I think that the key event for the SNP this year isn't this programme for government, which wasn't much of a programme at all, the key event this year will be the budget in December, when we get tax and spend proposals. And that will, I think, be the backdrop to some of the issues that will dominate the campaign when it starts in earnest, probably in April of next year. Now, one of the headlines, of course, was the scrapping of peak fares. And one of the themes of our
On the
podcast,
trains, yeah.
in the
Yeah.
trains, one of the themes of this podcast is the way in which politicians don't seem to take policy decisions on the basis of very, very clear points of view. They're buffeted around. And again, and we could perhaps come on to this other one about the GP appointments, which is, well, there we are, 100,000. Well, that'll make a big difference, won't it? But on these peak fares, there was a pilot scheme on this, and in fact, the Scottish Government extended the pilot scheme in terms of abolishing peak fares. We were told that in order for this to be a self-financing measure, that there would have to be an increase of passenger numbers of 10%. In the event, what we got was an increase in passenger numbers of 6.8%. So clearly, in doing this, it's not self-financing. Now, it may well become self-financing if, when these peak fares go on the 1st of September, there's a whole lot of people going on to the trains. And indeed, this is worth, if you're traveling between Glasgow and Edinburgh, is worth quite a lot of money to you over the course of a year. They're saying it's about sensitivity with the cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
Well, if that really was the case, why didn't you, after the pilot, simply say, we're going to scrap the peak fares? And of course, the answer to this question, is that they said, we now have the fiscal headroom to go ahead with this. This is yet another, in inverted commas, free thing, and the people who will get most out of it will be the middle class commuters who are paying higher fares. This again can be seen as more sweeties for the middle class to keep them on board. Now, I haven't seen a figure attached to this in terms of what it's going to cost the government. But again, we could go through all of these policies, and I simply ask the question, is that the best use of public money when the government have already missed their targets on child poverty, and we have so many citizens that are in a pretty distressed and marginalised situation?
Well, this is the question, isn't it? That fundamentally the question with the rail fares and so on is, what percentage of the cost of running the railways should be paid by people who use the railways, and what percentage should be paid by people who do not use the railways in terms of a subsidy towards those who do. Now, I think nobody suggests there shouldn't be any subsidy to ScotRail, in the same way as nobody suggests there should be no subsidy to CalMac or bus operators and so on, because people understand the public good of the being public transport. But you're absolutely right. The fundamental question is, what share of the burden should be paid by the people who actually benefit most from the service, and what share should be paid for by the poor, long-suffering taxpayer. The further irony, I think, on this, John Swinney, the big section in his speech outlining the legislative agenda, or the political agenda, really, actually, for the year ahead, was on this sort of cost of living. And the SNP have had this long-standing thing that Scotland's, quote, unique social contract, unquote, allows for citizens to take advantage of quote, free, unquote, stuff that isn't available in England. But of course, the irony of this is that in large part, this is only, and this is something that is felt very strongly in the Labour Party at the moment, much of this is only affordable to the extent it's affordable at all, because of the Barnett formula and Scotland's uniquely privileged place within the UK's funding arrangements, which again, not to repeat oneself too unduly, but nevertheless, Scotland has the funding commensurate with being a poor part of the UK, while at the same time being actually a comparatively wealthy part of the UK. And the Barnett formula is not a needs-based funding formula. And for all sorts of historical reasons and so on, Scotland benefits from it immensely, whereas by comparison, for instance, Wales, not that many people in Scotland really care very much about what happens in Wales, Wales actually suffers from the Barnett formula because its arrangements are less favourable to Wales, although there is a greater need in Wales than there is in Scotland. And so, from the Labour Party's point of view, if you speak to Ian Murray or Kirsty McNeil or other, ministers in the Scotland office and so on, they will say, look at it, Rachel Reeves has handed out, billions in extra funding in the next couple of years for the Scottish government. And this is being used to fund the SNP's election agenda, if you like, that we are giving the SNP a stick with which to beat us, and we are paying for the stick too. And we get no thanks for that extra funding. But the SNP gets all the upside and none of the downside from this. And, that is something that is perhaps baked into the architecture of devolution. And so it doesn't really matter whether it happens to be a Labour government in the House of Commons or a Conservative government. It's something that gives whoever's in power in Scotland the opportunity to be, gives them a political advantage that is denied to the opposition. And, there are plenty of people in the Labour Party and so on who note the irony of this just now.
Yes, and there's an echo there in a column that I read in the Times the other day.
A very good column, wasn't it?
Not only are Labour being beaten with a stick, but they've paid for the stick as well. I thought that was a good piece of journalese. Of course, the other thing that was one of the headlines from the announcement was 100,000 more GP appointments. Now, the British Medical Association, you could almost hear the guffawing in the statement which they put out. Now, 100,000 seems a lot of GP appointments until you then consider that every citizen in the country, over 5 million, is actually registered with a GP. And in terms of the number of GP practices in Scotland, up and down the length and breadth of the country, the capacity for GP appointments in any one week is 650,000 appointments. So in actual fact, what was announced by the government and Parliament the other day in terms of 100,000 appointments was that an increased capacity of just over 1 day. So the idea that this is going to be transformational in terms of people going onto the phone lines at 8 o'clock in the morning, and on the stroke of 8 a.m., they are then told you're number 27 in the queue. We've all been there with this. This is not going to make, in my view, a material difference, which is why I say that the really big issue for the government this year aren't these 6 bills, isn't bringing the legislative programme forward. I think that what we got with the scrapping of the peak fares was an indication of what we're going to get in the budget, which of course is that we're going to use all the headroom that we have in order to make the voters feel good before they go to the polls. Most political parties actually do it before an election. Before the last UK general election, Sunak was Chancellor, then Hunt was Chancellor, and then both of them decided to cut the rate of national insurance by 2%. That was a 4% cut.
That lot of good it did them.
Yes, completely and utterly unfunded, based upon unpredicated cuts in public expenditure should they win the election, completely and utterly irresponsible. And the problem with giveaways, and you can make the case for giveaways. The rail unions and the STUC have been campaigning for the scrapping of peak fares for many years. There's a perfectly legitimate argument to be made for doing this. The problem, though, is that when you look at public expenditure over a whole series of issues, you do really rather get the impression that what is being done by government is a whole load of easy spending decisions, where they've got the fiscal headroom to do so, to keep the middle classes sweet and on side, when there are a lot of poor folk in Scotland that should be the government's number one priority. That's the issue that I have with it. If you spend in one area, you can't spend on another area. So I think that when we get to the financial statement, the budget in December, look for more of these giveaways. I suspect that the one that they will focus in on yet again will be council tax, because increases in council tax this year in the city of Glasgow, it went up by 7%, which was at the lower end of increases. And of course, what was it, 15%, 16% in a couple of council areas. So absolutely huge increases. And I suspect that what the government will do, they might not get away with trying to fund a full freeze, but they'll cap perhaps council tax increases next year and mitigate. They're always mitigating. We will mitigate. And again, mitigating is a perfectly acceptable policy. And it's a particularly acceptable policy because it embarrasses the Labour Party. But yes, the irony is not lost. The government, just over a year ago, were in a difficult position financially, had agreed a whole series of pay increases in the public sector, which they hadn't found the money for, and they were completely and utterly bailed out of their financial hole by Rachel Reeves. That's probably a good time to say,
Yeah,
Mr. Swinney, 1 year on.
exactly. A
It's
beautiful link there, Bernard. Again, seamless. You old pro, you.
my old pro. Mr. Swinney, 1 year on, he steadied the ship. He steadied the
Yeah.
ship. And from that point of view, I think, again, from the government's point of view, done a pretty good job.
Yeah, I mean, John Swinney's whole ethos, the whole point of his administration, it seems to me, is make government boring again. We have had too much excitement in Scottish politics over the last 10, 12 years, and it is time to put an end to such things. And that if we can lower the temperature of Scottish politics, then that is job well done, as far as he is concerned. And I think, one has to look at Swinney's first year in office and think that, judged on that metric, if you like, it has been a considerable success. In fact, I was speaking to a former Conservative candidate the other day and so on, and he said a rather heretical thing, perhaps in Conservative circles, so on. Is it possible that John Swinney's first year in government has been, is he one of the better First Ministers we've had? And okay, it's a limited field, and you have a couple of, if you like, non-runners in Henry McLeish and Humza Yousaf. Donald Dewar is obviously, his term as First Minister, A long time ago, B then obviously cut short. So you're then left with Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, who both of them significant figures, but also very polarizing and divisive figures, and so on. And I think that's a reasonable question, actually. Where after a year do you put John Swinney in the sort of league table of First Ministers? And I think I think I sort of rather agree with this former Tory candidate that yes, he's in the top half, certainly. There haven't been any great disasters, as I say, make government dull again. His first year is essentially a rebuke to both Humza Yousaf and the latter time of Nicola Sturgeon. A lot of Sturgeon's legislative agenda, her worldview, more pertinently, has been dumped by John Swinney. Climate change targets, all the sort of stuff that people might consider virtue signalling. All of that has gone by the wayside. And again, I think, as I put in the paper this week, and so on, the influence of Kate Forbes on a lot of this, shouldn't be underestimated. And the Deputy First Minister and John Swinney have a better relationship than either really thought they were going to have, because this was something of a marriage of convenience, given the situation and the circumstances, the straits in which the SNP found itself. But it has actually worked better than either really thought. They are both, in one sense, small c Conservatives. Neither of them is a radical. Neither of them is an obvious socialist. Both would consider themselves left of centre. But when you look at it and so on, you think, well, really, in terms of temperament, are you? I don't know. Where would you put Mr. Swinney's first year?
Well, I actually think, Alex, the analogy isn't with Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon. I think the analogy is with Jack McConnell, actually, because if you remember, we had Donald Dewar, who died very early into the office, with the Holyrood building project running way over budget, there was a sense in which, in the early days of devolution, it looked as if the whole thing was capable of collapse, and people, were ridiculing it. They can't even build a Parliament building. Not important to get into the details of why the procurement went so hideously long, but Peter Fraser had a very full report on that. Dewar thought several times about resigning because of the cost overruns at Holyrood. He dies. Henry McLeish and Jack McConnell, both of whom, incidentally, were on manoeuvres when Donald was First Minister. They were already looking at the succession. Henry gets it. Immediately rebrands the administration through the adoption of free personal and nursing care. Again, you have to ask yourself the question, is this really what centre-left politicians should be doing, in the sense that free personal and nursing care was already the policy for poor pensioners? It was already given to poor pensioners. What you were doing here was extending this to pensioners who had some money. So again, you can make the argument for the policy, but some people on the left will say, well, all of the money should go to the poor, the poorer pensioners. McLeish sort of lasts a year, driven from office with a silly scandal about the sublet of his constituency office. It should never have come to that. But it was a muddle, not a fiddle, and he then had full disclosure, which turned out not to be full disclosure. He eventually resigned, and at that point, we're on to our third First Minister in the first term, one who has died. Holyrood building project, uh, holding almost these politicians up to ridicule. Henry having to resign, and Jack McConnell, very quietly, very deliberately, steadied the ship, did one or two useful things like the smoking ban, but got the show on the road. And people forget just what a pickle Labour were in at the time. Jack McConnell steadied the ship. And after the general election last year, there was a sense that people might be saying, are the SNP about to go under finally? Well, a bit like Jack McConnell, John Swinney has steadied the ship.
Exactly. I mean, remember Jack McConnell's, slogan, if you like, for which he was ridiculed at the time, was "Do less, better." And the pause, if you like, between those is important. The comma is very important there. And but John Swinney has a similar approach, I think. Let's cut all of the green crap, if you like. Get back to basics. It's a little bit, yes, of poverty reduction in terms of relative poverty reduction, the NHS more than anything else, and so on, because that's the preeminent public service and so on upon which the government is likely to be judged. A renewed focus on industry and corporate Scotland, where again, Kate Forbes' role in that is very important. There's talk of a reshuffle at Holyrood and so on, and from time to time people say, oh well, Kate Forbes has never had a delivery ministry, if you like. She's not been in charge of education or health, but it seems to me that absolutely crazy to move her when she is the chief point of contact between the SNP and the business community, a business community that felt, I think with some reason, ignored by Nicola Sturgeon in particular. The former First Minister's natural sympathies do not lie with corporate Scotland. And rebuilding that relationship has been very important, I think, in the last year. It's a clear shift of emphasis, even allowing for the fact that, the Scottish Government's powers with regard to the economy are comparatively limited. It's nevertheless important, I think, that the business community feels that they have people they can talk to in the government, and they did not feel that in Nicola Sturgeon's administration. They did not feel that in Humza Yousaf's administration. They do now, because Kate Forbes is much more sympathetic ear for them. And again, in the programme for government, there was lots of talk about how, in terms of a reaction in part to the current international economic uncertainty and Donald Trump's tariffs and all the rest of it. And so, what can the Scottish government do to support Scottish business, support wealth creation in Scotland? There was quite a lot of emphasis on that. And that clearly, I think, comes not just from the First Minister, but from the Deputy First Minister too, and is a shift of emphasis. And again, doesn't require a legislative programme. It doesn't require a government bill to do this. And that is where Swinney's administration is genuinely different from its predecessors, and it's a remarkable trick in some ways that John Swinney has managed to pull off, I think, which is that he has managed to present himself as a genuinely new ministry, despite having served in government himself for all but 12 months of the last 2 decades, essentially. And that is a heck of a trick to pull off.
Yeah, and I think that it's an important thing that government ministers and senior ministers do have a relationship with Civic Scotland, not just the third sector, but the business sector, that people feel that their door is open, that they get a sort of sympathetic hearing whenever they're lobbying for stuff. It might not be the kind of sexy stuff which has a direct impact on the number of votes a party gets at election time, but if you're delivering stuff, in government and you go through a sticky period, if your relationship with stakeholders within Scotland is a good one, they'll temper their criticism. I mean, I remember sort of years ago, Michael Forsyth, of course, when he was Secretary of State, Conservative Secretary of State,
a great unifying figure.
he was always at war with the sort of the building blocks of the Scottish state because he thought they were irretrievably lost to socialism and all the rest of it. So he would go after the EIS, he would go after COSLA, he would go after the STUC.
Not effectively enough, one might say. I mean, all of those organisations continue to exist. None of them have been put on the prescribed list of terrorist organisations.
Yeah, and it didn't do him. It didn't do him much good. But if you look at some of his predecessors, I remember actually a COSLA figure and an EIS figure quite separately said that you would go in and meet George Younger, and he was so eminently reasonable that you left the meeting almost on a high. And then about half an hour later, you'd worked out that he hadn't actually offered you anything. But the fact is that you got the hearing, and the personal relationship established with the Secretary of State, and it does count, and it tends to count when things go wrong and people are looking to criticize you. Of course, all of this is pinned to the election next year. We're about a year away. And we've had opinion poll number 7 this year. The fieldwork was done between the 2nd and the 5th of May. Servation with a pollster for True North. It's broadly in line with the previous 6 polls, but the SNP at 33%. You would have to go way back last year to find them as low as that. The Tories, an all-time low, and certainly polling in recent times, down at 11%. Labour at a fairly miserable 19%. The Lib Dems at 11%. We should probably keep an eye on them. It looks as if they're finally going to make some headway next year. The Greens at 5%. Alapa at 1%. And Reform UK at 19%, not really surprising given the bounce of the by-election and the English local elections last week. But we've got this trend which is perfectly clear, which is that the SNP are well out in front. Labour are going to come second. The Tories are going to have an absolutely dreadful night of it. And the only issue would appear to be how high will Reform UK go. My view of this is that when the election does get underway in a year's time, Reform will actually fall back because, unlike at the moment, they will be the subject of scrutiny at the election time. And, Mr. Farage's previous party, UKIP, used to publish manifestos for Scottish elections, which simply did not stack up. They didn't stack up at all. And I think as they come under scrutiny, people will start saying to themselves, well, do I really want to vote for these people? And at the end of the day, by-elections and opinion polls register a sense of frustration with voters. When it comes to electing a government, the psyche of the voter going into the polling station is completely different. That being said, I would be very surprised indeed, even if they do fall back, that they don't get one MSP in each of the regions.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, that seems quite clear. And it would be a dramatic fall now, actually, for Reform to get less than that. The question, I suppose, is, is Reform's support going to be strong enough that they get 2 seats per region, or is it just going to be 1? That is something, obviously, that we'll have to wait and see. I rather agree with you. I think at the current polling, there's so much attention on Reform right now as the trendy pick in some ways, that there's a sort of recency bias to the opinion polling right now, that where people are sort of saying, oh, well, everybody else seems to be voting Reform, I might as well. I would expect that to fall back a little bit. I think you're absolutely right to highlight the Lib Dems, and at a UK level, I think it's interesting that so little attention has been paid to the progress that Ed Davey's party is making, particularly in southern England, not just the southwest, where there's a stronger liberal tradition there, but right across southern England and even into the Midlands as well. That the threat to the Conservative Party in particular there is from the Lib Dems as much as it is from Reform, and so the Tories are caught in this sort of trap there. There's a spillover effect of that in Scotland as well, where the Lib Dems are respectable once again, albeit that in Scotland their support is very heavily concentrated in no more really than half a dozen or so constituencies. But you would expect the Lib Dems to have a good showing at the moment, without themselves actually offering very much in the way of a policy platform. And I think that's one of the things which people in our trade overestimate sometimes, the importance of detailed policy platforms and manifestos, because voters don't really pay a huge amount of attention to what's on page 37 of a political party's manifesto. They vote as a sense of feelings, or the expression of a sentiment or a sensibility. And for the Lib Dems, nobody really knows what Alex Cole-Hamilton and his colleagues in the Scottish Parliament really stand for or offer. The point is what they are not, and they are not the SNP. So if you don't like the SNP and you don't like independence, then the Lib Dems are one of the possible landing spots for your vote. And if you don't like the Conservative Party, again, the Lib Dems are a possibility there. And if you're disappointed with how Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and their colleagues are doing at a UK level, then again, the Lib Dems are an acceptable landing spot for your vote. What the Lib Dems would actually propose or stand for is neither here nor there. They are a nice party, if you like, as seen as such anyway by a lot of voters who don't want to have to spend too much time thinking about politics. They're the beneficiaries of that sensibility, I think, which is quite widespread now. People who wouldn't dream of voting Reform, but some of the instincts that lead people to vote Lib Dem are similar to some of the instincts that lead people to vote for Reform.
I remember asking the late Margot MacDonald when she was a journalist. Margot worked at STV as a politics presenter, what she thought of the Liberal Democrats, and her answer was that at party conferences they did the best baking and knitting. So there we are.
Exactly. I mean, well, my late mother voted Liberal Democrat normally and so on, and she hated politics, had no interest in it whatsoever, and that is, if you like, the sort of core constituency for the Lib Dems.
I should point out.
Something I've been meaning to ask you for a while, Bernard, actually, and so it is, when you think back to, if you look at what Reform are doing right now and so on, and how they're polling, across the UK, obviously they poll better in England than they do in Scotland, but they still, poll really quite significantly well in Scotland. And I wonder, if you go back to 1984, 1985, are there parallels that can be drawn with the SDP Liberal Alliance in the sort of mid 1980s? Because there were times then when the alliance was not just outpolling Labour and so on, but there were times where they were seen as the coming party. The possibility that David Steele or David Owen might be Prime Minister, etc., was talked up a lot in the press. I'd be interested in hearing what you think in terms of are there parallels?
Yes, there are, not exactly, because in fairness, when the SDP was formed the day after the Limehouse Declaration, The Limehouse Declaration was a pretty lucid statement of political principles, and the SDP, in conjunction with the Liberals, did work out a number of costed policies. You don't have that level of detail, but well, there is an analogy. If people and younger people won't remember this because they wouldn't have been around, but when Roy Jenkins did his famous Dimbleby lecture, which was the forerunner for the creation of the Council for Social Democracy, which was the forerunner to the Limehouse Declaration, which was the forerunner to the launch of the party in March of 1981. What you had there was a sense in which what they were trying to do was to break the mold of politics, because the established political parties are not working for you. Now, there is an echo in breaking the mold of politics with Farage. And the reason why he will never be prime minister and people can rest easy in their beds, if you look at what the SDP in alliance with the Liberals did, they were getting opinion poll ratings at their height of 50%. 50%. There's no sense in which Reform UK are anywhere near this. Jenkins, of course, stood in the Warrington by-election, didn't win it, eventually won Hill Head. Bill Pitt won Croydon North East. Shirley Williams won Crosby. And in 1983, the popular vote for the alliance was 27%. Labour were only 0.5% ahead of the alliance in the popular vote. And because of the electoral system, it effectively put a brake on their ambitions. And then when there was post the election, the disintegration over defence policy in the mid 80s, they didn't become quite so relevant. But there are echoes. But to a certain
Of course, the SDP, of course, famously struggled to get credible candidates in by-elections in particular, didn't they, Bernard?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I did not stand as an SDP candidate. I think I should make that clear. But neither was I a knitter or a baker.
No. I don't think anyone's ever accused you of that.
So it's a very good point. It's a very good point. In some respects, because it used to always be said of the SDP that they were a media-created party, and there is a sense in which all the publicity that Reform UK get, you think they're surviving on media coverage. I remember that one of there was two Scottish Labour MPs who defected to the SDP, Robert McLennan in Caithness and Sutherland, and Dixon Mabin in Greenock and Port Glasgow. And Dick Mabin was asked on an interview by Willie Ross's daughter Fiona once, Dr. Mabin, aren't you just a media-created party? How are you going to keep all of this going? And Dick Mabin, in very Dick Mabin tones, opined, the Lord will provide us with by-elections.
Yeah, and this is. I mean, it's we have more recent examples of this too. I mean, Change UK, Chuka Umunna, and so on. There was a moment where well, is this going to break the mold of British politics? I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that Reform have a better chance of doing that than other would-be breakers of the mold. But it remains the case that there's still a party that has half a dozen MPs. The Liberal Democrats have 72, and yet far more attention is paid to Nigel Farage and Reform than it is to the Lib Dems, and that's partly because they're more colourful, they're new. But I think that as a result of that, the media's enthusiasm for things that are new and shiny and colourful is sometimes unhelpful, I think, in terms of seeing what's actually going on. And so I think I agree with you that this is potentially the high watermark for Reform. One shouldn't be complacent about these things. There's always the possibility that one is completely mistaken. But nevertheless, the British political system has survived many threats to it, if you like, and one shouldn't assume, and again, this is a media failing of long-standing duration and so on. There's a terrible bias in favor of what's happening most recently, and then a projection that if current trends continue, then X, Y, or Z will happen. But the whole point about current trends, or indeed trends at all, is that they do not continue. They are superseded by new and different trends. And so, to that extent, I take the if you like, the threat of Prime Minister Farage, I rather discount that, because I don't see it happening in the same way as I think, and for some of the same reasons that you don't see it happening.
Yeah.
But the mere fact that it is talked about is clearly, from a political point of view at a Scottish level and so on, is clearly advantageous to the SNP, because it gives them a very useful bogeyman against which to argue. And to reiterate the case, not just for voting for the SNP in terms of stewarding the Scottish government within a devolved settlement, but also to reanimate, like the currently lifeless corpse of the national question. And you see it again on SNP social media stuff and so on. Is do you want Prime Minister Farage, or do you want an independent Scotland? Now, I don't think this is going to be sufficient to actually revive that corpse, but it is quite clearly useful for the SNP, and that is the direction of travel in which they are going to go over the next 12 months.
Yeah, and the trends in the polls are all very clear, and we are heading, I think, for a rainbow parliament. The analogy that we should draw is probably the second Scottish Parliament election with 2003. But when that election comes, one of the issues which will not dominate, for which Mr. Swinney must be eternally grateful, is gender recognition. And of course, this week, Nicola Sturgeon made her point of view very, very clear. She said that she accepted the authority of the Supreme Court, as if there was a choice not
big
to
of her.
the authority of the Supreme Court. The SNP supported the establishing of the Supreme Court when the legislation establishing it went through the House of Commons. So she accepts the authority of the court, but she clearly doesn't agree with the decision. And she actually said in that she thought that the lives of trans people could become unlivable, and that she was greatly concerned about the draft advice that was coming out of the Equality and Human Rights Commission in terms of what it was going to mean for single-sex spaces. And clearly what she wants, and this is what she's not going to get. Incidentally, I know that there are lots of people saying that she should apologize for the position that she took on this. Look, you can't ask politicians to be straight with you and give them your opinion. And when they give an opinion and they champion legislation, and that legislation is called on by the UK government and effectively a central tenet of it, struck down by the Supreme Court, you can't ask them to apologise for their point of view. She is entitled to her point of view, and I'm sure that there are many trans people who think that she still articulately represents their case. Now, here is where, frankly, she's barking up the wrong tree. What she wants is some halfway house between some of the guidance which is in place at the moment and some of the stuff which will accept the logic of the Supreme Court that sex, this is a matter of biology. There is no third way on this. There is no happy medium. At the end of the day, the judgment of the Supreme Court will find its way into recommendations about how public bodies and so on take that forward. And the crude reality is there ain't a third way on this at all.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right, I think, but to say that she shouldn't be required or bullied, if you like, into offering an apology that she quite clearly doesn't believe is merited, and would be consequently transparently insincere. But she her thinking on this has not, if you like, evolved at all. She still, in my view, characterizes her opponents as essentially being bigots. That there is not very much difference between how Nicola Sturgeon views these questions and how somebody like, say, Maggie Chapman, the Green MSP, views them. And Nicola Sturgeon continues to say, well, there just is no clash ever in any circumstances between the rights of trans-identifying people and women, most particularly. And yet, I think it's quite obvious that there are occasions when there is that clash. So, for example, who is allowed to participate in women's sport, for instance, is a very clear and straightforward illustration, I think, of that clash. Who is entitled to a place in the women's prison estate? Again, a fairly clear and transparent clash of interests. Who is entitled to access women's refuges, rape crisis centres, and so on, places that are single sex for a very good and obvious and persuasive reason, and again, is there a clash there? And actually, it was her own government who said that, in court, they were taking a different line in Parliament and in their public pronouncements on this issue and so on. But in court, the Scottish government accepted that as a matter of law, people without a gender, trans-identifying people without a gender recognition certificate were, as a matter of law, their biological sex, not their certificated sex. And so, if trans lives are to be unlivable now, then they were surely, in the majority of cases, unlivable then too. And this is something that I think Sturgeon, isn't prepared to address, isn't prepared to accept, actually. And so, the frustration I think that a lot of people have with her on this issue is that, at no point has she actually ever really listened to or taken on board the respectable and reasonable criticisms of her approach and so on. She was very much signed up to the Stonewall mantra of no debate. Other people's views on this were, as she said herself, simply not valid. And so I think the quest or the enthusiasm to get her to sort of eat crow and apologize, is understandable, while at the same time being misguided, because I agree with you. I don't think she's required to change her view just because her government lost a court case, but I can also understand why people who feel that Nicola Sturgeon is rewriting history in certain respects on this, and by saying, well, we had a very full and open debate about all of these issues. A lot of people say, well, actually, no, we didn't, because you didn't actually take on board any of the criticisms that were made, or the objections that have been subsequently demonstrated to be rooted in what is the law, not what Nicola Sturgeon thinks the law ought to be.
We're 46 minutes in, so literally in a couple of minutes, let's do some sort of tidying up issues. Interest rates, Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, probably going to make another cut. And the tariff wars, the trade wars, still have an overhang in terms of how central banks are viewing things, how government are viewing things. I just wonder, Starmer and Reeves have had a very, very difficult time of it. And but it looks as if there's a trade deal with India. It looks as if the trade deal with the United States is more or less there and over the line. These are not inconsiderable moves forward for the government in terms of their growth mantra. We might just be seeing the first signs where they are beginning to get a grip of things. I also detect, I may well be completely barking up the wrong tree here, but given the anger within Labour ranks about what happened on the doorstep in these 23 councils that were up for election last week, and given the amounts of money that we are talking about, I merely ask the question, could there be the first major U-turn and they will reinstate the winter fuel payment?
Possibly. I mean, that would be quite humiliating, I think, for them, because they've made such a big deal about it. I think in policy terms, we've said before and so on, I think, scrapping the universal eligibility for the winter fuel payment is a wholly defensible proposition. But clearly, politically, it has been an absolute disaster for the Labour Party. I suppose, in terms of interest rates and trade deals and so on, the question is, it's that old line of Napoleon's, isn't it? I'm not interested in good generals or bad generals. Give me a lucky general. And the first year of Keir Starmer's government has been unlucky in many ways, and the government has made mistakes. You have plenty of Labour MPs and so on who now acknowledge that, but in terms of wider economic movements, is it time that that Dame Fortune changes her tune and begins to smile on the UK and consequently, therefore, on Rachel Reeves? The government's ability to influence some of these things is comparatively limited, but you can begin to put together with, as you say, the trade deal with India in particular, which is quite substantial, will have a very significant impact, particularly for Scotch whisky, actually, which over the next 10 years we'll see, it's the tariff on whisky exports to India reduced from, I think it's currently 140% to 40 or 50%, still quite high, but obviously much better than currently the case. Is there a sense in which the government's luck will change, and a lot of what happens over the next couple of years obviously depends on that being the case. It's not impossible, I think, to construct a scenario or a story in which it does change and it begins to look a little bit better. But in terms of economic growth, that remains the be all and end all. That is the only way out of the fiscal crunch that the UK is heading towards.
Just final contribution from me. He's got three things going for him. One, it's 4 years to a general election, or before there has to be an election. He's got a lot of time to try and turn this around. Secondly, I think the Reform UK bubble will burst at the election because the electoral system will put a brake on their ambitions. And a little bit like the SDP Liberal Alliance, who, in terms of electoral plateaus, were much higher than what Reform are doing. And thirdly, the Tories are beyond useless. And at the end
well, on
of
that I think we can agree on that too.
at the end of the day, when you're looking at this, you might not want him, but you look at the Tories and you think, really, seriously. And so all is not lost for Labour, and it's 4 years away. But of course, the fallout from a very difficult and ropey first year, there will be a downside for Anas Sarwar unless he, at the election, can focus things on the record of the Scottish government and keep the election campaign to that issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I suppose one should say, Russell Findlay, we know you listen to the podcast and so on. You have hitherto ducked all invitations to come and appear on it and so on, but we would love to chat with you and so on and to see if you agree with Bernard that the Conservatives are, quote, useless, unquote, and if, what you're going to do about it. So come on, Russell, come on the show and show us what you're made of.
Look, he was a colleague of mine at STV. We worked together for a couple of years. He's very clubbable, very affable. So yeah, come and say hello to us, Russell.
Yeah, and that seems like an obvious concluding point for us. And also, as we've now talked for quite a long time and so on, a year to go until the Scottish parliamentary election. We'll have plenty more to discuss, obviously, over the next 12 months. But for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.